It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the air felt thick with stillness. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long shadows over the neighborhood. It had been one of those days for John, a Medal of Honor veteran. The kind where the weight of the world didn't seem to press so hard on his shoulders, where the memories of his time in combat seemed distant. He was just an ordinary man now, blending in with the crowd, trying to live the peaceful life he had dreamed of after his service. John walked down the cracked sidewalk, hands shoved deep into his pockets. The light from the street lamps flickered as evening began to fall. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the trees lining the street, and the quiet was only broken by the occasional hum of passing cars. It was a peaceful neighborhood, the kind of place where you would expect nothing but tranquility, and that was exactly what John liked about it. A few houses away, kids were playing on their front lawns, their laughter ringing out in the air. He watched them for a moment, remembering the joy he once had in the simple moments of life before the war. Before everything changed. But for now, he was just happy to be home. He had been to the local diner for lunch, ordered his usual nothing fancy, just a burger and fries. After that, he spent a little time reading the newspaper in the park. Now, it was time to head back to his small apartment and unwind. As he turned the corner onto his street, he noticed the flashing lights of a police car. It wasn't unusual to see police cars in the neighborhood. In fact, this part of town was known for its tight-knit community and, occasionally, the occasional disturbance. John didn't think much of it. He kept walking, not expecting the trouble that would find him that day. The police car slowed as it approached him, the engines hummed loud in the quiet street. John wasn't nervous. He had lived through enough, seen enough, to know how to keep his cool. He had met cops before, some friendly, some not so much. It wasn't uncommon for a police officer to stop and ask questions, and John had learned to handle these situations with the quiet confidence he had gained from his years in service. But today felt different. The car came to a stop just a few feet in front of him, the two officers inside not making any effort to drive past him. John stopped walking, his boots scraping against the pavement as he shifted his weight to one leg. He looked up, meeting the eyes of the officer in the passenger seat. The man was young, maybe in his early 30s, with a rough look about him. His eyes had a hardened edge, and he looked like someone who had seen too much of the world and, perhaps, hadn't liked what he saw. The driver, a larger man with a short beard, was quieter, his face unreadable. He glanced over at John but didn't say anything. For a moment, they just stared at each other. John's posture was relaxed, a silent challenge to anyone who might try to get under his skin. He had fought in wars, faced unimaginable horrors, and survived. He wasn't intimidated by some officer who didn't know a thing about real danger. Finally, the officer in the passenger seat broke the silence. "What's a guy like you doing out here?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. John raised an eyebrow, not understanding the tone. "Just heading home," he replied, his voice calm and steady. There was nothing strange about his answer. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He had every right to be on this street just like anyone else. The officer seemed to take issue with this. "You think you're better than us or something? You don't belong around here," he said, his voice getting louder. His words hung in the air, heavy with something John couldn't quite place. It wasn't just a question, it was a judgment. A stereotype. John could feel his heart rate rise, but he didn't show it. He had seen far worse in his life. He had stood before enemies with far more venom in their hearts, and he had learned that staying calm was the best weapon of all. "I live right around the corner," John said, keeping his voice even. "I'm just trying to get home." The officer smirked, looking him up and down. "Yeah? What's a guy like you even doing in this neighborhood?" he sneered. The words felt heavier now, more cutting. John could sense the anger beginning to bubble just under the surface of the officer's words. John didn't answer immediately. He simply stood there, watching the officer, waiting for him to get it out of his system. His hands remained in his pockets, his stance relaxed but ready. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to fight. But he wasn't going to take insults, either. The officer's face twisted into a sneer. "You know, I bet we're wasting our time talking to you. Should've just arrested you on sight." John's chest tightened slightly. This wasn't the first time he had encountered someone like this, someone who judged him based on nothing more than his appearance or their own twisted assumptions. But he wouldn't let them win. He wouldn't let their ignorance have power over him. Before John could say anything, the officer made a sudden movement, a small spitting motion that landed squarely on his shirt. The officer's laughter followed quickly after, mocking John's response. The sound cut through the quiet evening like a knife. John's heart stopped for a moment. The insult was unmistakable. The officer had deliberately spit on him. A wave of disgust rolled through him, but he didn't let it show. He stood still, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the officer. The officer's partner, who had been silent up until now, chuckled. "That's right, old man. You got no place here." The two officers laughed together, the sound harsh and mocking. John, however, stood his ground. His jaw tightened, but he didn't say a word. The situation was escalating, but he knew better than to let his temper get the best of him. The officer, clearly expecting a reaction, leaned in. "What's the matter? No fight left in you?" "Huh?" He raised his hand, gesturing to John, taunting him further. John said nothing. Instead, he took a slow step back, turned, and began walking away. He felt the weight of their laughter behind him, but he didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what he was walking away from, a situation that was beneath him. As he walked down the street, he felt a strange calm settle over him. He had fought wars, stood in the face of unimaginable odds. Nothing these two men could say or do would compare to what he had already faced. He didn't need to prove anything. His silence, his refusal to engage with their cruelty, was his response. And in that silence, he found his strength. The officer's laughter slowly faded as John continued his walk. He didn't look back. He just kept walking, knowing that sometimes, the best way to deal with ignorance and hatred was simply to walk away from it. The universe, he believed, had a way of balancing things out. And as John disappeared down the street, the officers in the car had no idea what fate had in store for them. John continued walking away from the officers, his boots striking the sidewalk with steady, deliberate steps. The laughter from the police car behind him faded as he moved farther down the street. His mind, though, was not as calm as it seemed. He felt the sting of the officers' actions, the bitterness of their words. It wasn't the first time he had been disrespected, but it was the first time in a long while that he had been so openly mocked for nothing more than being who he was. He kept his head forward, determined to put it behind him. The last thing he wanted was to let their behavior get under his skin. He had learned long ago that letting others control your emotions was a dangerous thing. But as he walked, he couldn't help but feel a growing frustration. It wasn't just the spit. It wasn't even just the racism. It was the arrogance of those officers, the way they felt entitled to make someone feel small, someone who had served and sacrificed in ways they could never understand. John reached the corner of the block, where his small apartment building stood. He could see the windows of his top-floor unit from here. Just a few more steps, and he'd be able to retreat into his sanctuary. It was a modest place, far from glamorous, but it was his. It was quiet, comfortable, and offered him the solitude he had come to appreciate. As he turned the corner to the building's entrance, he heard the screech of tires. The sudden sound made him pause. He didn't look back, but instinctively, his body tensed. He felt something in the air, a shift, like a storm was coming. A car, speeding fast, came barreling around the corner just as John reached the entrance of his building. It was a blur of motion, a flash of metal, and John instinctively took a step back, his heart racing. A split second later, the car's tires screeched again as it lost control. The vehicle swerved across the road, spinning out of control, veering toward the sidewalk. John's reflexes kicked in, and he instinctively stepped back even farther, feeling the rush of adrenaline flood his system. The car slammed into a parked van with a sickening crunch of metal. The impact shook the ground beneath John's feet, and the noise was deafening, a sharp, metallic scream of destruction. For a moment, everything was silent. The world seemed to hold its breath. John's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't hesitate. He rushed toward the wreckage, his mind already calculating what needed to be done. The car had come to a halt, its front end crumpled, smoke pouring from the engine. The driver and passenger, two men John immediately recognized as the officers who had just mocked him, were still inside, dazed but alive. John's military training kicked in. He had been through enough dangerous situations to know how to respond in emergencies. His first instinct was to check for injuries, assess the situation, and get help. He moved quickly, his heart pounding, but his mind focused and clear. The police car's windshield was cracked, and one of the officers, the one who had spat on him, was slumped against the steering wheel, his face pale. The other officer was dazed, his hand clutching his head in confusion. John didn't waste any time. He pulled open the door to the driver's side, the metal creaking under the pressure, and checked on the officer behind the wheel. The man groaned, his eyes unfocused, but John could tell he wasn't seriously injured. Still, the man was in no condition to drive. "Stay still," John said, his voice calm but firm. He moved to the other side of the car to check on the passenger. That officer, too, appeared to be alive, but he was holding his side, wincing in pain. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, but it didn't look deep. John took a deep breath, assessing the situation. He didn't want to get involved any more than he had to, but these men were in trouble. They were officers, yes, but they were also human beings, and he couldn't leave them stranded like this. His sense of duty, the same one that had guided him through countless dangerous missions, kicked in. "Are you able to move?" John asked, turning to the officer in the passenger seat. The man nodded weakly, his face contorted in pain. "I think so. Just, don't let anyone know what happened." John raised an eyebrow. It wasn't the first time he had heard someone ask him to keep quiet about an accident, especially when it involved police officers. But this time, something about the request felt off. The words were almost frantic, as though the officer was more concerned about the consequences of the crash than about his own well-being. Without replying, John helped the officer out of the car, supporting his weight as they both made their way to the sidewalk. John's eyes scanned the area quickly, looking for any other signs of danger. There was no immediate threat, but he knew the situation was far from over. The officers would need help, and the crash was already causing a scene. Just as he started to move toward his phone to call for an ambulance, he heard the unmistakable sound of sirens. Police backup was on its way. The flashing lights appeared down the street, getting closer with every passing second. John took a step back, his instincts telling him to stay out of the way. He didn't want to be caught in a situation where things could turn against him. He wasn't a fool. He knew the kind of trouble a police officer could bring with them, especially one who had already shown a clear bias against him. But just as he was about to leave, something unexpected happened. The officer he had helped, the one who had been sitting in the passenger seat, looked up at him. His expression had softened, almost as if he were seeing John for the first time. "Thanks for helping us," the officer muttered, still struggling to catch his breath. There was a hint of shame in his voice, something John hadn't expected to hear. John simply nodded. Just doing what anyone would do. With that, the police backup arrived. The officers took charge of the situation, and John quickly stepped aside. He didn't want to draw attention to himself any more than necessary. But as he watched the backup officers handle the scene, he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation wasn't over yet. He had helped the men in their moment of need, but he also knew that their actions earlier in the day would not go unnoticed. The officers were taken away in an ambulance, their injuries not life-threatening but serious enough to warrant medical attention. John watched as the paramedics loaded them into the vehicle, his thoughts racing. He had never been one to gloat, but in that moment, something felt almost poetic. The officers, who had once treated him with disrespect and arrogance, now found themselves in a position where they needed the very thing they had refused to give him: help. As the ambulance disappeared down the street, John stood there for a moment, looking at the empty street. He had done his part. Now, it was up to fate to take care of the rest. John stood still for a moment, watching as the police officers were driven away in the ambulance. The scene around him began to quiet down. The flashing lights of the emergency vehicle slowly faded as they disappeared down the street, and the sounds of sirens and shouting faded into the distance. For a brief moment, everything felt still, as if the world had paused, holding its breath. But that pause didn't last long. The street, once so peaceful, was now filled with people. Neighbors had gathered outside, curious about the commotion, whispering to each other as they watched from their porches or windows. John could feel the eyes on him, the weight of their stares, but he didn't let it bother him. He had done what he could to help the officers in need, and now it was out of his hands. But as the crowd gathered, something started to shift in the air. The veteran, who had long been accustomed to being overlooked and ignored by the world around him, now stood as a figure of quiet strength. People were starting to talk about what had happened. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. Some of them had witnessed the crash, and they began to piece together what had happened, slowly starting to connect the dots. John didn't mind the attention, though. He had earned the respect of those who mattered long ago. He had served his country, put his life on the line, and done his duty. The opinion of strangers didn't weigh heavily on his mind. But what he hadn't expected was the shift in the way the neighborhood was looking at him now. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up, its sirens still faintly ringing in the distance. A new set of officers stepped out. These were different officers, ones that John didn't recognize. They were the backup, the ones who would be taking over the investigation of the crash. John could tell from the way they carried themselves that they weren't part of the previous officers' group. They seemed more professional, more focused, and there was no hint of arrogance in their eyes. John watched as they approached the scene. The officer in charge, a tall woman with short cropped hair, looked at him with a steady gaze. She gave him a nod of acknowledgement. "You were the one who helped them?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. John nodded, standing tall. "Yeah. I was there when it happened." The officer studied him for a moment, her gaze intense but not judgmental. "What happened?" she asked, her tone businesslike. John took a deep breath. He didn't want to get caught up in the politics of the situation, but he knew he had to explain what he had seen. So he did, giving the officer a clear, straightforward account of the events as they had unfolded. He told her how the car had come barreling down the street, how he had reacted instinctively, and how he had helped the officers after the crash. He didn't sugarcoat anything, but he also didn't add anything unnecessary. The officer listened carefully, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she didn't say anything for a few moments, just stared at him with a thoughtful expression. Finally, she spoke again. "Thank you for your help," she said simply. "Most people wouldn't have done that for them." John simply nodded. It wasn't about them. It was about doing what was right. The officer gave him another brief nod, then turned her attention to the wrecked car. She motioned for her team to begin the investigation. John watched for a moment, then turned away, deciding it was time for him to head home. He didn't want to linger any longer. There was no need to stay and watch as the situation unfolded. He had done what he needed to do, and now it was out of his hands. But just as he was about to walk away, he heard a voice calling his name. He turned around and saw the officer who had spoken to him earlier, the one who had nodded in thanks. She was walking toward him, her face serious but with an edge of curiosity. "Can I ask you something?" she asked, stopping a few feet away from him. "What made you help them?" John paused for a moment, surprised by the question. It wasn't something he had expected to be asked, not in the middle of a situation like this. He thought for a second, trying to put his feelings into words. "I guess I just did what anyone would do," he said finally, his voice calm and steady. "It's not about them being cops or anything. It's about knowing what it feels like to need help. And I've been there before." The officer didn't respond right away, but she nodded slowly, as if understanding. "Yeah, I get it," she said softly. "Not everyone would have stepped up like you did. Especially with the way things have been, but thank you. It means something." John gave her a small nod, but he didn't say anything else. He wasn't one for long conversations, especially with strangers. He appreciated the officer's words, but he wasn't looking for praise. He just wanted to be left alone, to return to his simple life. As he turned to leave again, the officer called out to him one last time. "You know, not everyone is as kind-hearted as you," she said, her voice carrying just enough for him to hear. "You did the right thing." John didn't turn back around, but he smiled to himself as he walked away. It wasn't about the praise or the recognition. It was about knowing that, for once, things had played out the way they were supposed to. He had done what was right, even when the world around him was trying to tear everything apart. When he reached his apartment building, he made his way up the stairs to his unit. His mind was still racing, trying to process everything that had happened. But as he entered his apartment, the familiar surroundings of his small space offered him some comfort. The quiet, the solitude, the peace. It was all he had ever wanted. But deep down, John knew that this incident wasn't over. He had seen the shift in the way people were looking at him, and he knew it wouldn't be long before word got out about what had happened. The officers would have to answer for their actions, and the fallout from today's events would continue to ripple through the neighborhood. Still, John was content to leave it all behind. He had done what was right. Now, he could rest. The world would find its balance on its own, with or without him. And as he sat down in his chair, looking out the window at the quiet street below, he couldn't help but feel that, for the first time in a long while, the universe had finally delivered some kind of justice. You said the days following the accident were strangely calm for John. He returned to his quiet routine, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of life. But even in the quiet moments, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Something had shifted, not just in the way people looked at him, but in the way they saw the world around them. It didn't take long for the news to spread. Word about the crash, about the officers and their humiliating treatment of John, traveled quickly through the neighborhood. The story was simple enough: a police car had crashed, and the hero of the story wasn't the officers inside but the Medal of Honor veteran who had been mistreated earlier that day. The more people talked, the more the story changed, until it became less about the crash and more about the respect John had earned through his life of service. People who had never spoken to him before began to nod at him as he walked down the street. Some of them smiled, some simply acknowledged him with a brief wave. It was small, but it was a change. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and he wasn't sure he liked it. Still, it was a sign that things were shifting, that the story of the officer's failure had somehow turned into a reflection of the kind of man John was. But as the neighborhood began to view John in a new light, the officers who had treated him so poorly were dealing with their own consequences. The police department, too, was forced to confront the situation. The accident had raised questions too many to ignore. Internal investigations were launched, and it wasn't long before the two officers found themselves under intense scrutiny. John didn't know much about the details. He didn't care to. He had moved on from the incident. The officers had made their own bed, and now they had to lie in it. He didn't need to involve himself any more than he already had. However, news continued to trickle out, and the whispers reached him. The first sign of change came in the form of an official letter. It was from the police department, addressed to John. He didn't expect much, probably just an apology or some sort of formal acknowledgement of the incident. But when he opened the letter and read the words, he realized that this was more than just a simple apology. The letter began with a formal recognition of the events that had taken place. The police department expressed regret for the actions of the officers involved, acknowledging that their behavior was unacceptable. They also thanked John for his composure, his restraint in the face of provocation, and his willingness to step in and help the officers after the crash. The letter ended with an invitation to meet with the police chief personally, to discuss the situation further. John read the letter twice. It was sincere, at least on the surface. There was no mention of blame or finger-pointing, just a straightforward acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done. He didn't know if he wanted to meet with the police chief. Part of him didn't see the need. But another part of him thought that perhaps this was an opportunity to make things right, not just for him, but for everyone who had witnessed the officer's treatment of him. The decision weighed on him for a few days, and he finally decided that it couldn't hurt to hear them out. He wasn't expecting much, but it might give him a sense of closure, or at least some answers. So he called the number on the letter and arranged a meeting. When the day came, John was greeted with the same calm demeanor he always carried. He dressed simply, as he always did, wearing a plain shirt and jeans. He wasn't looking to make a statement. He wasn't looking for recognition. He just wanted to be treated with respect. The meeting took place in the police station, in a quiet office where the police chief awaited him. The chief, an older man with graying hair and a stern but kind expression, stood up as John entered the room. They shook hands, and the chief motioned for him to sit down. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me," the chief said, his voice warm but measured. "I want to start by saying that I am deeply sorry for the actions of my officers. What happened that day was unacceptable, and we are taking steps to ensure that it never happens again." John nodded but said nothing. He didn't need to say much. The apology, however formal, was enough for him to hear. The chief continued, explaining the internal investigation that was underway and the disciplinary actions being taken against the officers. The officers involved, he said, would be facing consequences. They would be required to undergo additional training, focusing on community relations and professionalism. And, in the case of the officer who had mocked John so openly, there would be further review. "It's not just about fixing the mistake," the chief said, leaning forward slightly. "It's about learning from it and making sure we're better moving forward. You've been a part of this community for a long time. We should have respected that. I can't undo what's been done, but I can promise you that we're working to make things right." John listened intently. He didn't speak right away. He wasn't angry anymore, he had let go of that emotion a long time ago. But he couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. Not because the officers were being punished, but because the system was acknowledging its fault and trying to make improvements. After a few moments of silence, John finally spoke. "I appreciate your honesty," he said simply. "But it's not just about the officers. It's about making sure everyone feels safe, no matter who they are. That's what matters. The chief nodded, his expression softening. "You're right. That's something we're committed to. It's going to take time, but we're going to keep working toward it." John didn't stay long after that. The conversation ended on a positive note, but there was nothing else left for him to say. He had gotten what he came for: a sense of closure, a promise that things would change, and the knowledge that his actions had made a difference. He didn't need to stay and watch the officer's downfall. He had done enough. As he walked out of the station, the air felt fresher somehow, like the world had just tilted slightly in the right direction. There was still a long road ahead, but in that moment, John felt like he had helped move things forward. And that was enough for him. The world had a way of balancing things, of righting wrongs when least expected. But it was up to each of us, in our own way, to be the ones to tip the scales. John had done that, not by seeking revenge or recognition, but by simply doing what was right. In that quiet, unspoken way, he had made his mark. "You said," John's life returned to its familiar rhythm after the meeting with the police chief. The events of the past week seemed to settle, like dust finally finding its place after being disturbed. He continued his quiet walks through the neighborhood, his routine unchanged, but there was something different in the air. People no longer just glanced at him as he passed, they acknowledged him, smiled, or offered a friendly wave. It wasn't just a change in how they saw him, but how they saw each other. It was like a small shift, a quiet ripple in the community that made everything feel just a little more connected. But even as life seemed to return to normal, John couldn't shake the feeling that things had, in some ways, permanently changed. It wasn't just about the officers or the crash, it was about the larger truth that had come from it. Sometimes, the world had a way of revealing its flaws, of showing the cracks in the system. And even though it hadn't been a perfect resolution, John knew that something important had happened. The neighborhood, the community, had witnessed something that made them reconsider the assumptions they had made. They had seen a man who had been wronged, but instead of seeking revenge or making noise, he had quietly chosen to do what was right. It wasn't always easy to choose the high road, but John had learned long ago that it was the only way to live with himself. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He didn't need the recognition or the praise. He simply needed to know that he had done his part. And in that, he found peace. As the days turned into weeks, the story of the crash began to fade from the public eye. The officers involved in the incident faced their consequences, but they were no longer the focus of the community's attention. The police department had made its adjustments, and the officers were sent for additional training. Whether or not they changed, John would never truly know. But he didn't need to dwell on it. They had their own paths to walk, and he had his. The neighborhood, however, began to shift in ways that John couldn't ignore. The subtle tension that had always lingered in the air seemed to dissipate. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now greeted each other with more openness. Children played outside more, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Even the local shops felt more welcoming, as if the community had become just a little bit warmer, a little more united. John had always preferred his solitude, but he found himself enjoying the small moments of connection with those around him. He would stop to chat with a neighbor while walking down the street, or share a friendly conversation with the shopkeeper at the corner store. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him feel like he was part of something bigger than himself. One afternoon, as John sat in his favorite chair by the window, looking out at the street below, a knock on the door interrupted his quiet solitude. He wasn't expecting anyone, so he rose slowly, wondering who it could be. When he opened the door, he found a young man standing on the other side. The man was holding a small envelope in his hand, his face a mixture of uncertainty and gratitude. "Are you John Morris?" the young man asked, his voice a little nervous. John nodded. "That's me. What can I do for you?" The young man hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, handing him the envelope. "I just wanted to thank you for what you did." For helping those officers, even when they treated you badly. My father's one of the men who was in that crash, and I just wanted you to know that I respect what you did. Not many people would have done the same. John looked at the envelope for a moment, then back at the young man. He wasn't sure what to say. The gratitude in the man's eyes was genuine, but it wasn't necessary. He had done what he thought was right, but hearing the words felt different. It felt like a full circle, like the universe was quietly acknowledging his decision, even if it was in a small, personal way. "Thank you," John said simply. "But I didn't do it for the thanks. I just did what I hoped anyone would do." The young man smiled, his eyes bright. "I know. But still, you showed me something I didn't expect. You showed me that there's still honor in the world, even when things seem messed up. You did the right thing." John nodded slowly, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. It's just about doing what's right. No matter what. The young man stood there for a moment, as if weighing his words. "I'll never forget that. I just wanted you to know that." With that, the young man turned and walked away, leaving John standing in the doorway, holding the envelope. He didn't open it right away. There was no need. The message was already clear. The gratitude, the respect, it was all there in the young man's eyes. And in that simple moment, John realized something: he hadn't just helped those officers. He had helped change the way people thought, even in the smallest of ways. As the days went by, life continued its steady pace. John didn't dwell on the events that had unfolded. They were behind him, and he had done what he could to make things better. He wasn't looking for anything more. His life was simple, and that was enough for him. He was content to walk the streets, to enjoy the quiet moments of his day, and to know that he had made a difference, not in a loud, obvious way, but in a way that quietly rippled through the community, like a stone dropped into a calm pond. The officers, the crash, the apologies, it was all part of a bigger story, one that John had played a small but important role in. But it wasn't just about them. It was about the people who saw what happened, the people who witnessed a man choosing to do the right thing even when he had every reason to walk away. It was about the reminder that sometimes, the smallest actions had the biggest impact. And as John sat back in his chair, looking out at the street below, he felt at peace. The world wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always fair. But in that moment, he knew that he had done what he could to make it just a little bit better. And that was enough. The world would keep turning, but John Morris would always carry with him the quiet pride of knowing that when it mattered, he had chosen to do what was right.